Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring voices from the Valley to bear on some of the most complex social issues of the day. Today we're joined by Karen Jacobus, who is the coordinator of health education at Mount Holyoke College, and Robert Goodman, who is a professor of Emeritus of Urban Studies and Environmental Planning at Hampshire College. Both are experts in the area of gambling and have served on commissions. Bob has written a book called The Luck Business. So we're looking forward to talking a bit about the casino controversy in Massachusetts. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Karen, talk a bit about your work with the state and how you have been an advocate in terms of framing the issues around the economic advantages of casinos and at the same time some of the psychosocial issues involved.
Yes, in addition to my work at Mount Holyoke, I've had the opportunity, excuse me, to be a training and education consultant for the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling. And the Massachusetts Council really is a nonprofit that is there to really look at reducing the impact of problem gambling. And so what the council primarily has done is worked with the legislature as they've moved forward to create this new effort and really trying to ensure that people with problems around compulsive gambling are sort of factored into, like you say, the idea of around the economic development related to this issue. The council does not really take a position pro or con, but it really is making sure that all the services are in place for people who then may be impacted by this in a negative way.
So Bob, your book, The Luck Business, yes. At the beginning of the book you talk about the fact that you went into this with an open mind. You were being objective with respect to the data, the research, and yet there was a good deal of pushback, you thought, from officials, from those who were in the industry. Talk about that process.
Well, the first thing I like to say is I gamble myself, so this is not a moral, ethical issue. I don't have a problem with that. I wound up getting a grant from the Ford Foundation. And we had a 2-year project at the University of Massachusetts where we looked at the economics of legalized gambling, what the impacts would be in the state. And we looked at it throughout the United States. What we found was that with the exception of places like Las Vegas, where you bring in a lot of tourists from outside, most of the new gambling ventures, including what's being proposed now in Massachusetts, are really geared to local people. And when that happens, you get very different economic impacts. In the case of Las Vegas, people come, spend on average about 4 days, lose their money, and then whatever problems they have, bring it back to their home community. I mean, it's a big problem in Las Vegas with compulsive gamblers, but most of it goes outside. When you do it locally, all that problem stays there. Not only that, but you're sucking money out of the local economy. Money that goes into gambling is not being spent for buying a new car or a new shirt or whatever. So we didn't know that at the beginning, but the more we got into it, we saw a very big difference between local gambling, which we term convenience gambling, and tourist destination gambling. In Massachusetts, they're saying they're going to have tourist destination gambling. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, it hasn't happened in other states. I don't think people will fly in to gamble in Springfield when they have an opportunity to fly to Las Vegas to get. If you're a serious gambler, you're going to wind up in Las Vegas. So that was one of the primary conclusions we came to, and I wrote about this in the book. I did get pushback. I mean, I had Steve Wynn calling me and telling me I was hurting a productive business, and I had state senators calling me, telling me I shouldn't be doing this, and there was even an investigation of the project by a senator looking at what we were doing at the University of Massachusetts. the effect was it just gave us more publicity for the study. I mean, we weren't doing anything nefarious. We were trying to be as objective. As I said, I gambled myself. I wasn't trying to stop gambling. I was just looking at the state's involvement in it. And one of the things we found that we weren't expecting was that as the states got more into it, their role as regulator of gambling diminished. Their role as promoter of gambling increased. The problem is if a state is now dependent on gambling for revenues, who's doing the regulation? The state has shifted from that role. And this is a really big problem. I mean, probably the biggest promoter of gambling in the United States right now are state governments.
That's interesting. So, Karen, let's talk a little bit more about the social issues involved. A small percentage of people are gambling addicts, and yet there are issues related to domestic violence, to child abuse, to homelessness. Could you talk about those issues and the impact that they have on local communities?
And like you said, you know, for the majority of people in this country, somewhere between 80 and 90% of people do gamble. Most do not have difficulty. People who fit the profile of the pathological gambler are around 2 or 3% of the population. The thing that's actually interesting in some of the additional work that certainly concerns me in my role as health educator at Mount Holyoke and otherwise, is that there are a larger percent of college students that are more at risk, and that risk runs around 6%. And so in terms of the impact that we see, like you said, there are incredibly increased rates of domestic violence. Even though this percentage of people may be small, the impact on a number of people is very high. And so there are domestic violence, there's child abuse, there is an increased risk for suicide. We know that 1 in 5 people who are pathological gamblers have attempted suicide, which is higher than any addictive other types of behavior. And then the serious financial impact that has not only for that individual and their family, but the impact that then will have on their community. And so we find that tends to be an area where we are incredibly concerned. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that as we increase availability and proximity to gambling, we again begin to see this increase in the number of problems. As you were saying, you know, I think for a number of students, the closest right now for us is to go, you know, to Connecticut, and students who are 21 will sort of make that pilgrimage to sort of go and be able to gamble. If it is in our backyard, then I think the dynamics of that change tremendously. And so what you see happening is they have found that if there are 1 or 2 venues for gambling to occur, again, particularly with adolescents and college-age students, you have, again, around 3% of people who sort of fit that profile. As you increase the numbers of opportunities for those things to happen, anywhere from now maybe 6, 7 opportunities, and that includes everything, lottery, casinos, whatever, you almost double the number of people. And so that piece of it is, again, a concern as we bring it closer to our area. And I think colleges in particular have been a little bit reluctant because people don't really see it at this point. And but I think that we're all going to see a shift as this comes closer to our communities, and it is no longer a trip that you can stop on your way home.
That's absolutely true. In fact, one of the concerns that unfortunately the legislators in Massachusetts didn't look at would be the impact on the approximately 450,000 college and university students here. As everyone knows, this is a major place for students to be. I'd just like to read to you, just to give you some idea of the problem here. In Rhode Island, where the legal age to be in a casino is actually 18, and the concern in Massachusetts is, you know, if the revenues go down, there may be legislators pushing for 18-year-olds to gamble. But here's what happened during the campaign in Rhode Island to have a casino. The casino company put out an ad, and this is what it said. The resort casino will be an amazing new place for Rhode Island college students to have fun when they're taking a break from studying. Now, in that case, the Rhode Island voters turned it down. But it gave you an idea of where the casino companies were heading, and I think this will be a very serious problem if we have casinos in Massachusetts. As you heard, the rate of problem gambling for college students is higher than for adults. So this is something that ought to, be seriously considered in terms of legalizing casinos in this state.
Even apart from casinos, now with the use of technology,
yes.
Online gambling, and we've all heard tragic stories of students who max out on their credit cards and then become suicidal. And if you go to the casinos, it's 24 hours. It's not just the slot machines, but the off-track betting. And so talk a bit about how technology is impacting.
Well, that's the leading edge. Right? I mean, there are at least 4 or 5 states now that have legalized online gambling, and other states are moving in that direction. Former Congressman Barney Frank of Massachusetts has pushed for federal legalization of online gambling. When that happens, the problem will be exponentially multiplied beyond what we have now. And with once the states go into it, it's very difficult for them to make an argument, that there shouldn't be online gambling, because they're essentially saying, this is no problem. People can do this in the normal course of events. So I think this is going to be much worse than it already is.
And I think also what happens is that we actually know right now that the lottery tends to be sort of the #1 venue that students are using, and then sort of card playing, then sports betting. And so the internet piece really is a small percentage, but like you say, it's growing. And I think as we look at the casinos being another place, one of the benefits of some of the legislation that's in place is actually making sure that information on sort of resources and how to identify when someone's got a problem are very much integrated into these venues. You're not going to see that with the online betting. I think, like Robert said, it's going to be sort of a free-for-all in terms of people not really, again, having access to the information that they might need that would help them identify if there was going to be a problem. But we have heard about a number of students, like you said, who sort of become consumed by the gambling, and it's quite easy. Students also have incredible access to credit and credit cards, and so as they can sort of just sit and play and never have to leave their room. So I think there, again, is a tremendous amount of education that we can be doing, in particular with our Res Life staff, to say, again, if you're noticing certain behaviors, these may be some of the questions that we want to ask, which may not even be on people's radar at this point.
One of the things that we looked at early in our study was how much the casinos depended on people with gambling problems for their revenues. And we found in different parts of the country, it might be, we thought, and there weren't any really serious studies of this, but by talking to experts and consultants, we found that somewhere between maybe 30–40% of the revenues would come out of problem gamblers. Just recently, 2 reporters for the Wall Street Journal looked at this issue, and we were really underestimating the problem. I'm going to just read to you what they found. Just 2.8% of players provided 50% of casino revenues. 10.7% of the players provided 80% of the casino revenues. So what the casinos are dependent on, and now the state governments are dependent on, relatively small number of players, major number of whom are addicted gamblers, who provide the major part of the revenues of a casino. So what you have now in terms of public policy to consider, do we want to depend on people with behavioral problems to pay for public services? This is essentially what this gets down to. If we legalized drugs, would we want to depend on those people for paying for public services? In effect, many states depend on people who smoke to pay for public services because of the taxes they get from that. So this is a slippery slope. You know, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Politicians talk about how they can, particularly now, how you can have public services without raising taxes. I mean, traditionally, taxes pay for public services. If you can then say, well, we can get people with behavioral problems, whether it's smoking or gambling or drinking or whatever, to pay for public services. What kind of government do we have? I mean, is this what we're headed for in the future?
Right, if you go back to John Stuart Mill and the liberty-limiting principles, and he's arguing, well, this extreme liberalism, only the harm principle is a legitimate justification for restricting individual freedom. But then we have legal paternalism and legal moralism. So if you look at paternalism, you could say it really is in the best interest of the individual gambler to restrict access to these venues. The assumption is that people are autonomous, that they're acting freely. But if you are addicted, then you are not acting freely, at least under some views. And so these are complex social issues.
Well, you know, we've come to the point where we say it's proper for government to restrict certain kinds of activities. For example, we're concerned about workers' health and safety. We don't seem to have too much of a problem saying we ought to put restrictions on the way companies operate to make sure that their workers are working in safe conditions. We put restrictions on, you know, what kind of cars can be manufactured to make sure that people are safe when they're driving cars. If you go back at least to the beginning of the 20th century, and especially during the 1930s and the New Deal, and what came out of that, you have a movement of government trying to protect individuals. If you shift now, where government is dependent on people with behavioral problems for revenues, you're moving backwards, moving to conditions that existed in the 19th century. And this is a serious problem for public policy. It's not just gambling. It's, you know, the direction that government's going. If legislators continue to say, you know, we can provide public services without raising taxes, that's inevitably one of the directions they're going to move in. Very disturbing.
So, Karen, the governor's proposal had money built in to deal with addiction services, and it would raise the level of support that's provided by the state now. Could you talk a bit about the governor's proposal and where you think it might help individuals if casinos are approved?
So one of the things that is clearly written into the legislation is probably one of the most generous pieces around that. There was a lot of research that was done based on the work that was done in Canada, where again there had been percentages of money set aside primarily for prevention, intervention, and treatment. And so this particular budget that now has been proposed as part of this would tremendously support the program that's happening. There's looking to do training with all of these venues, specifically through the council, and ways in which that information would get out to the players that need to have that information. There are ways to provide more services in terms of more treatment programs. Right now, the Mass Council does have a helpline, which, if I can plug a little bit, is 1-800-426-1234. And I think, again, it would allow staffing to increase for those services. But I think there still needs to be a tremendous amount of education done across the board. And I feel like I've been doing this for a long time, and it feels like this piece is where the addiction field was maybe 20, 30 years ago around alcohol and other drugs. This still tends to be a very invisible addiction, and I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it. So I think, in essence, what's going to happen is as this moves into our communities, I think all of a sudden there's going to be a lot more requests for those kinds of services.
It's true, and I'm certainly in favor of, you know, people being counseled, you know, have these problems. But the reality is, you know, in terms of being effective, at least the figures we see, you know, not more than 50% of people who are counseled actually get help. And these are people who ask for counseling. Then there's a whole range, thousands of people who don't ask for counseling, remain addicted, gambling, their families suffer. But it's not just the individual that suffers, not just their family that suffers. What happens with addicted gamblers is the way they behave affects other people and other businesses economically. Let me give you just one example of this. One of the things we found is that the addicted gambler doesn't pay his debts, doesn't pay taxes, winds up committing crimes, usually white-collar crimes, committing fraud on credit cards, on their insurance. That raises everyone else's premiums and costs for credit cards. In some cases, they're put in jail or put through the criminal justice process. You increase those costs. So other taxpayers and other businesses, you know, a contractor who was working for an addicted gambler who didn't get paid is now losing money, and he may not have nothing to do with gambling. Mm-hmm. So these are impacts for other people. And you know, the studies show these are thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands actually, if you look at a state, that's costing other people and other businesses. And it's not going to be solved just by counseling people. Mm-hmm. You know, it's only going to be solved by reducing the ability and the encouragement of people to gamble.
So are these services that are on site utilized by people? Do people walk into the casinos and they see the Gamblers Anonymous office and walk in?
Well, what they have found is the studies have shown that it is at that moment, you know, and I think the more they're talking about these kiosks actually being available, you know, having the numbers of, you know, in Connecticut of the local hotline number posted right near the machines. It is. There's sometimes people will have that moment where all of a sudden they may be in such distress, but you've got to be able to sort of see it and have access to it at that moment. And so we find that that can be helpful to people, but I do agree with Robert in terms of sort of the bigger question around what are we doing with all of this and whose responsibility is it? Again, is it all on the individual gambler and the person with the addiction, or do we need to be looking at it in a larger way?
So how do you identify whether you have a gambling problem? What are the signs, and what can families do to support loved ones they think are at risk?
So in basic terms, you know, anyone whose gambling is causing difficulties for them sort of fits on that continuum. There is a specific diagnosis that you can get through the DSM-IV around pathological gambling. I'm looking for my notes here. And so what needs to be in place for you to fit that profile, which again, if you think of it as a continuum, is sort of out on the far end, is 5 or more of these characteristics. So it may be everything from there is a preoccupation with gambling. This isn't just the person that goes down with some friends and has set a limit for themselves. You know, we're going to spend a couple $100, we're going to go down, we're going to have some fun, and then when it's done, we all walk away. So there's a tremendous amount of preoccupation with for the pathological gambler. They need to gamble in increasing amounts to sort of get the same effect, to get that same excitement. And so that we see happening similar to an alcoholic, where there is an increase in tolerance that's needed to sort of get the same desired effect. There are repeated unsuccessful steps taken to either cut down or to stop the gambling. That, you know, all right, that's it, I'm done. But the person is unable to sort of control the gambling once they get going. When they're not gambling, this person is incredibly irritable, restless, again, just really trying to think about the next opportunity that they're going to have. And you hear in particular about people, and I have seen this, and I know many of us has, as you stood in line in the convenience store. There are people that, you know, are getting their lottery tickets, and then you'll go down the street and they'll be at the other convenience store. And if you talk to some of the smaller convenience store owners, they will tell you that there, again, are a small group of people who, you know, will buy $100 here, $100 there, and they move. So again, that ability to sort of try to figure out where they want to be around that. And then there is the phenomenon they call chasing the loss. Where it's like, okay, I've lost everything, but you know what? I know if I just go back and I bet one more time, I'm going to be able to get all my money back. And it's that kind of thinking that gets people into trouble. Or just using gambling, and this is in particular for women, as a means of escaping their problems. That tends to be more of the way in which, rather than so much for that excitement part of it. Women tend to use gambling more as a way of coping with stress and other problems, and then that seems to be the place that gets them into that trajectory. And then people who end up having to borrow money from other people to bail them out. And this is often a difficult situation, often for parents, when they find out that their child may be much more heavily involved than they thought. And some people, it's a pretty serious situation, whether it's with a local bookie or it's with someone else. Now they owe some big money to people. And do you sort of bail your child out of that situation, or do they have to begin to feel the consequences and begin to make some different choices?
I think it's interesting that the therapy people have a diagnostic for the addicted gambler. One of the things that we've determined is that legislators, are becoming addicted to the revenues that they bring in from gambling. And I would like to see diagnostic of legislators, what they go through in terms of making these decisions about going into gambling. In terms of the addicted gamblers, we interviewed people who sold lottery tickets. And what they told us was that their biggest sales occur when the Social Security checks and the welfare checks come out. So now you have, an interesting phenomenon where government is trying to finance itself through its welfare and Social Security programs also.
You do talk in your book about the fact that there's not enough attention paid to alternative drivers for economic growth within communities.
Absolutely. In fact, I was speaking in East Boston a few weeks ago, and they turned down a casino there. You may have read about it in the paper. And one of the things they talked about was the need for alternative economic development. And they want it. They want the jobs. And they pointed out other places in Massachusetts where the government has helped local communities develop jobs through biotech, computer science, a whole host of other jobs. And they say, why don't they bring us that here? Why are they picking, the poorest communities in the state and giving us some of the worst forms of economic development? Why not bring us some of these other jobs, higher paying jobs, more secure jobs, and not bring it to these other communities, or at least give us some of it? And they're feeling being ostracized that way by having casinos put into their communities.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.